recording.
Okay, thank you, Emma.
Yeah, so introduce Mark to you. He's talking about inside the plugin pipeline. And please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll try and handle questions as we go along. But yeah, if I miss any, I'm sure we'll catch up at the end. So I'm looking at inside the plugin pipeline. So the sort of brief agenda, make sure kind of we're in the right sort of session. Let's have a look at what messages is all about in Dataverse, or the XRM platform for those of you who are on-prem. How that maps the plugin pipeline, how we can use that, how plugins can make use of all the information that's in the plugin context, how different plugin pipelines can relate to each other in a sort of parent-child sort of way, how that all relates to custom APIs, and how we can use some tracing to get some information out of trying to debug any problems that we've got. My assumption for this is to really get best out of this is you've probably maybe written a plugin, or at least got a decent working knowledge of C#, but maybe just wanted to try and see how else we can get more power out of those plugins. A little bit about me. I'm Chief Technologist at Data8, where I've written plugins, among other bits, for a number of ISV solutions. I've been doing that since CRM4, so thankfully, conceptually, not a lot has changed through that time. So most of the stuff we'll see today probably could have been applied since at least 2011, although I'm sure a lot of technology underneath has changed. Actually, a lot of the concepts, at least, are still the same. And you might also have seen some of my work in the XRM Toolbox tools that are listed there. You can get in touch with me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I've got my blog on there as well. So if you do have any questions as follow-up after today, then please do feel free to get in touch. So I want to jump in with, I think to understand plugins, you've really got to understand messages in Dataverse. So if you think of, if you're using Dynamics CRM or any other application within Power Apps, you might see a form that looks a bit like that. So what's going to happen when you click Save on that? So what happens now is, in the unified interface at least, is that it makes a request to the web API. So if you open up the developer tools in your web browser, you'll see a request being made that kind of looks like that when you hit Save, with all those details being populated. And if you see in the request URL at the top there, you can see that that's going to the standard web API URL. If you go in a different way, maybe you've written a bit of custom code using the .NET SDK, you might have some code that looks a bit like that. So given the I organization service, you can call the create method on it and pass it the entity that you want to go and create. If you want it to be a bit more long-winded in your C# code, instead of calling the create helper method, you can actually call the execute method and give it the full create request message that you want to do. So you are executing a create request, and the target of that create request is your new contact. So that's basically the same as the create function. And all these are basically doing the same thing. They are all calling a create message. They're giving it an input parameter, which is a target, which contains the entity you want to create. And it's going to return an output parameter, which is the ID of the record that's just been created. So if you're in Matt and Marlin's session just before, it was saying that most things that you want to do in Dataverse are probably covered by the 4 or 5 main messages. But actually, in just a basic Dataverse instance, not one that's got D365 sales or service or anything else installed on it, there's about 780 different specialist messages available in there. Although most of the time you probably won't involve yourself in much more than just those sort of basic 5 or 6, I would say, will probably do from most of the customization work you'd be interested in. There is a massive amount out there, and you can add to them as well. So if each message has basically just got a name, some inputs and some outputs, how does that get processed once that gets submitted to Dataverse, either through the organization service, through the web API, through the user interface? What's really happening behind the scenes there that we can then start plugging into. So this is essentially the plugin pipeline. So your message comes into Dataverse and it goes through these 5 steps. So the red ones I've highlighted here are bits where we can add in our plugins, and the blue bits are standard Dataverse implementations. So when you do our create message, for example, all that Dataverse would do without any plugins is that it would do some validation, make sure that you're not trying to set any attributes that don't exist, everything's in the right range, you haven't tried to put a name that's 1,000 characters long, or a birthday that's in the 1800s. And then it will do the actual main operation. It will create the record, it will save it to the underlying SQL database, generate the ID, and return it. And that's kind of it. We've got a choice though. If we want to do a plugin, we can do it at any of 3 different points along here. We can do it at the pre-validation step. Absolutely nothing has happened by this point. We don't know that any of that normal Microsoft implemented validation has been done. So we could have all sorts of rubbish in there. But that's the best place for doing any plugin that's going to do any extra validation. On a side note, I say if you've got critical validation that you need to do in your system, plugins are the only place where you can really rely on that validation having been done. If you're doing your validation in JavaScript, in business rules at the form level, you're asking for that to be bypassed as soon as you've got an integration, as soon as your users discover XRM Toolbox. These are all just going to bypass any custom logic that you put at the form level. So it's great to put logic there. It's going to give a much better user experience. But if you need something to be enforced, you need to do that again in a plugin to make sure that it happens regardless of how people are getting your data into your system. Moving on to that, we've then got pre-operation and post-operation. Now the choice between these can be a bit arbitrary. It can be important. If you want something to that's going to change how the main operation works, and we'll have a look at how that can work in a minute, that needs to be in pre-operation. If you need something that's going to work based on the result of the main operation, that's got to be in post-operation. But apart from that, it can make little or no difference which one of those 2 it goes into. But we'll have a look a bit more later on about some of the ifs and buts about which one of those 2 you should use. The other main bit to take away from that is that little overarching transaction that goes from pre-operation to post-operation. So this is the scope of the SQL database transaction for the underlying SQL server database that Dataverse is using. Anything that happens in pre-validation, anything that happens in validation is not part of that transaction. If you start having your plugin go off and create other records in pre-validation and then something goes wrong later on, that record is still going to be there. It's not, your change isn't going to get rolled back. Anything you do in the pre-operation or post-operation stages is going to get rolled back as part of that same transaction. So that can be a critical point in that decision-making process of where to register your plugin. So as that message moves through the plugin pipeline, what's really happening there is all your plugins are being called one after another in sequence, and this plugin context object is basically being moved from one to the next. The plugin context tells you what the message is that's being executed, like create, a list of input parameters, so the entity that's being created, any output parameters, so in this case the ID of the record that has already been created. You can add in shared variables, so plugins can share some extra state between themselves that might take it beyond the scope of what the input and output parameters normally do. You can also see some context about where you are in the plugin pipeline, so the stage will tell you a number. You might see those same pre-validation, validation, pre-operation, main operation, post-operation. Those are the stages of the plugin pipeline. You might see those referred to by stage number as 10, 20, 30, 40. You can also get access to the parent context. I'll come into that in a minute, but when one plugin calls something else, then you can start off more plugin pipelines and you can move from one to the next to get some more information about where your plugin got triggered from. You can get the mode of operation. So are you running synchronously or asynchronously? I think where plugins really come into their own is in synchronous operations, because it can make an immediate difference to what's happening within that pipeline. But having said that, if it can run asynchronously, you should do for performance reasons, so that you're not stopping anything else happening. And the mode will tell you which one of those two your plugin's running in. And then depth is related to the parent context. So the initial request that gets made, the create message, will be running at depth 1. That's the sort of top level pipeline. If a plugin triggers another pipeline, that'll be running at depth 2, and you can access the depth 1 via the parent context. And again, I will go into more detail about the whole parent-child relationship thing in a few more slides time. What most plugins will need to do, though, is they'll need to do something with the input parameters and maybe something with the output parameters. So you'll see a lot of code in the online docs that looks a bit like this. So if I'm registering a plugin on the create message, I'm going to say, does the input parameters contain a target? Is that target an entity? If so, cast it to an entity and then start working with it, which is not very readable. It's an awful lot of repeated code every time, but this seems to be how the sample code has just been forever on the doc site. A much nicer pattern that I got from Daryl Labar's blog a few years ago is this one. So in the same way as if you're calling this from an SDK external application, you would create a create request and pass that to the organization service. You can do exactly the same within your plugin. So you can create a new create request. You can give it the parameters that's coming from the plugin context. And from there, you can access all the properties of the request. So from here, you can do request.target, and that will find the target within those parameters. It will cast it to the right type. So by having those strongly typed request objects, you can eliminate all that casting. You can eliminate all those magic strings of parameter names because it's baked into those request types. So I'll link there to Daryl's blog if you want to go into that, and I think you've got some examples how to use that for custom actions as well. A common thing that your plugin will do after it's had a look at those input parameters is, I say, to do some sort of validation. So you can't do this because it doesn't meet some business requirements. As a good example, we had a problem internally where people would create contacts with a data8.co.uk email address. Now we're all in there as users. We don't need to be in there as contacts as well, and it would start confusing things about where tracked emails would show up. So we put in a rule to say that you can't create a contact with a data8.co.uk email address. And the way that you can stop that happening in a plugin is throw in an exception. As soon as an exception gets thrown anywhere in that plugin pipeline, the whole thing bombs out. No more of that plugin pipeline is executed. So if you're doing this in the pre-validation stage, then that create operation never actually happens. If you do it later on, it gets rolled back as part of the transaction. One thing you need to be aware of, though, is the type of exception you're going to throw. A plugin should only normally throw an invalid plugin execution exception, which is defined as part of the SDK. If you do that, you get the error message on the left when it comes back into the user interface. You can get the error message that you pass into the exception, and your users stand some chance of understanding what's going wrong. If you throw exactly the same message, but as part of an application exception, for example, you'll get the message on the right, which is no help to anybody. And suddenly you've got a help desk ticket and someone's got to go and have a look at plugin trace logs to go and figure out what actually happened. So you should always make sure that any expected exceptions, certainly, are thrown as invalid plugin execution exceptions, if for no other reason than you get a nice error message at the front end when it happens. Now, I mentioned about where in the plugin pipeline you should be doing this. So if you do have a plugin that's primary purpose is to stop something happening if it doesn't meet some rule. So you should do that as early in the pipeline as you possibly can do, ideally in the pre-validation stage. So it seems obvious that the earlier you can stop something happening, the less wasted time you're going to have. I don't like to take things just because the docs say you should do it. I'd like to see kind of what happens and actually measure some things. So I did that. So this is the results of how long it takes to create or execute a create request. Firstly, with no plugin registered, it took about 80 milliseconds to create some records just when everything was going smoothly. If I had a plugin that threw an exception and registered it in the pre-validation stage, that went up by about 30 milliseconds, just the overhead of throwing and catching exceptions, I would guess. But if I then move that plugin to later steps in the pipeline, you can see it getting slower and slower and slower. So doing it in the pre-operation stage rather than pre-validation stage, there's not a lot of difference within the pipeline at that point. It hasn't actually hit the database to create that record and had to roll that back, but it has had to start a transaction and then roll a transaction back. And that's added about another 20 milliseconds onto the call. And if I move it all the way to post-operation, so it has had to make that database call and it's had to roll back the creation of that contact or that account, that's added another 10, 15 milliseconds to the call. So just by putting the plugin in the right stage of the pipeline as early as you can do, you're reducing load on the server, you're limiting the impact of the service limits, and hopefully improving the overall performance of your system. 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds here or there as an odd create isn't going to make a world of difference. If you're doing this as part of a big integration, or if you're getting towards your service protection limits anyway, this sort of thing can start adding up. So I mentioned this this context gets passed from plugin to plugin to plugin. There's nothing to say that a plugin can't change something as it goes along there. Some things are read-only, but some things aren't. And the main things you should have a look at are the input and output parameters. Those can definitely be changed. And it's a supported pattern for those to be changed through that pipeline. For example, if you want to change a value as it's going to be created, if someone's creating a new record, if someone's updating a record, and you want to make sure a particular value gets set on that, rather than waiting for it to be created and then issuing an update afterwards in post-operation, change the value in the input parameters in the pre-operation stage. Then when the main operation bit actually kicks into that core bit of Microsoft code to go and create the record, to update the record, as far as it knows, that's exactly the value the user originally asked for. It doesn't care about where that value came from. So by the plugin changing that value, you stayed within the same plugin pipeline, and the main operation has just used your new value as if the user entered it themselves. Equally, you might sometimes need to change the values that are created by the main operation and that go into the output parameters. And you can do that with a synchronous plugin in the post-operation stage. So the most common way I've seen this is plugins that handle the retrieve or retrieve multiple messages. Generally, try and avoid putting plugins on those because they're called so often, then you can start seeing performance hits on that. But if you need to, and you need to change the results that a user will see after running a query or after loading a record, you can grab the results of that in the post-operation plugin, rewrite it to your heart's content, and send it on. And those results don't have to be related at all to the query they ask for. They're going to get some very confused users. But if you want to change everyone's name to Mickey Mouse when they issue a retrieve multiple on contacts, your plugin's quite at liberty to go and do that. So to take an example, if we want to make sure that we don't want to store telephone numbers in our system, they're of no use to us, it's too much of a GDPR risk, whatever the reason, it's a made-up example for the purpose of this slide. In the post-operation stage, you could issue an update to say, I want to update this account and set its telephone number to null after it's been created. So the main problems of that is that firstly, it will start another pipeline. So it's going to hit you with another API request against your limits. There's just the overhead of handling it generally. And you've also got a risk of infinite loops. If your plugin is registered to trigger on update of account, and you haven't been very careful about the attribute filters on that trigger, this is going to run and run and run until it gets killed by Dataverse's protections. On the other hand, you could have a plugin that does that on the input parameters and just sets that telephone number to null. It doesn't have to update it, it's just in memory at this point. But that will then get passed on as part of that plugin context later on in the pipeline. So when the main operation comes and does the update or does the create, there's no telephone number there for it to work on. So in that one, we've got one pipeline, we've got only the original API call, and we've only got one database hit. So it all adds up for better performance. I mentioned earlier shared variables. So this is quite an interesting bit, and it can be a little bit awkward. It can be a bit hard to debug why this doesn't work quite how you might expect it to in different ways, but it can be a powerful way of two different plugins in a pipeline sharing some information, sharing some extra context or state between themselves. If you've got a plugin that's in the pre-validation, pre-operation stage, and another one in the post-operation stage, one needs to know what the other one's done. You can use shared variables to pass some simple state between themselves. It's just a dictionary. You can put in pretty much whatever information you want in there. The only caveat is the values you pass in must be serializable, so you can't go off creating your own classes and putting them in there. If you stick to simple types, ints, strings, bools, whatever, you're on quite firm ground. I wouldn't really go too much more complex than that. The complexity comes with if you want to pass some state to a plugin that's actually running in a different pipeline, and again, we'll come to that later on. Just because you're putting it into your own context, when some other plugin is trying to read that shared variable, they might actually have a slightly different context depending on how that plugin got called. That's probably the most common query I see. I can't find my shared variable. I set it, but it's not there when I come to read it. You're probably actually in a different pipeline at that point. So you might then need to look up your parent context chain to go and try and find that shared variable. One very interesting thing I've found with shared variables that I wasn't aware of until recently, I wasn't sure whether this has been introduced. You can actually introduce shared variables from an external calling application as a way of adding some extra state, maybe for special cases during data imports, for example. So if you go back to our external, maybe console application, for example, that's going to go off and create this contact. Every message type can handle an extra input parameter called tag. This is a special name that's just introduced for everything. And you can set the tag parameter to any string value that you want. It's not exposed to any of the strongly typed request types, but you can put it in with that example code there. Now, when you come to your plugin comes to be triggered on that, it's exposed through the shared variables dictionary. So if you have a look for tag in your shared variables, you'll find the string that your calling application put in there. So your plugin can be called from your custom application. It could be called from any other operation being triggered within your application. But you can say, I think a good use case for this would be you want maybe a phone call to be triggered when a new account's created, to say that somebody's got to call them and follow up, introduce themselves. But if you're doing this as a bulk import or an integration from something else, you could set this tag parameter to say, don't do it for this particular case. So I think a really important way of being able to get some more information from your plugins about what's going on in the system in different stages when it's being called and make some more informed decisions about what it should be doing is to get this idea of the parent and child pipelines. So this is a quite common sort of plugin, I think, to create. As I mentioned, maybe when a new account's created, you want to go and create a new phone calls record, get the account manager to go and give them a call, introduce your company to them. So your plugin is going to go and create a new phone call record, and it's going to execute the create message on that. So we've got a create account pipeline that's run through. It's done all its normal things to make sure the account gets created properly. And then in post operation, we've triggered a plugin to say, I want to create a phone call. At that point, that's going to go off and create a whole new pipeline, which is going to run again for the create phone call message. So we've now got two pipelines running, one for one message, one for the other, but there is a parent-child relationship between them. Now, I mentioned before that there is a risk if you run, if you update a record during its own pipeline, there's a very good chance you're going to get stuck in an infinite loop there. So there are some restrictions on this that Dataverse puts in for your own protection. There is a maximum depth of 10. As soon as you get more than 10 of these pipelines running at once, that will trigger an error in Dataverse. The whole thing will get rolled back with an error. So you can prevent that by checking the depth property to say, if I'm already at depth 10, I can't do this. Probably it's a coding error and you need to go and fix that anyway, rather than just silently not doing stuff. So I wouldn't recommend just checking the depth property and deciding not to do something. I would let the error happen and figure out why it happened and stop that recursion happening. But within that plugin context, so you can access the parent context, and then from it, you can access its parent context, and you can keep walking up this chain of contexts. Within each of those, you can access all the properties of those contexts. So you can access the message name, you can access the stage it's at. Possibly the most useful at this point is to access its shared variables. So again, you can use these to pass state from one plugin to another, but now between entire pipelines, as long as they're triggered one from the other. So again, it might be that a plugin needs to decide that it should trigger if an account's being updated by the user, but maybe not if it's being updated as a result of something else happening. And it could do that by looking through that parent context chain and seeing if the top level context is the updated account, then it needs to happen. But if the updated account is being triggered by a merge of an account pipeline, it doesn't want to happen. That's quite a common one we see where people have put validation logic onto the update of an account or a contact record, and they're trying to merge those two records. When you merge two records, it tries to update one of them. And if it decides that that validation logic should kick in and it'll stop that, then you're stopping your records being merged. Even though you're trying to get rid of this record, it's still saying you can't merge them because one of them is invalid. So I know I'm trying to get rid of it. So you can use this parent context idea to get much more information about why your plugin is being called and making some more intelligent decisions about it. One thing I don't mention here, it's reasonably simple to say that one pipeline starts another one. If you remember that these last three stages here are within a transaction, and the first two aren't. When our plugin kicks in to say, I want to create a phone call, the new pipeline it's creating is still within that transaction, and the whole pipeline is in that transaction. So probably should really draw this more like that. So what's important to note here is that pre-validation and validation stages of any child pipelines are actually within that same transaction as the top one. So if anything goes wrong in those stages, your original pipeline is going to get rolled back to the start of that pre-operation stage. So you still got that entire transaction protection in there, and it now extends those first two stages of any child pipelines as well. So one thing that there's a common way of actually triggering these child pipelines without even really knowing about it, is these specialized update operations. So back in the day, I think was it 2016? I think this changed. If you wanted to change the state of a record, or if you wanted to change the owner of a record, you couldn't just update it and set those fields. You had to use these specialized messages. You had to call the set state message to change its state, and status code you had to call the assign message to change its owner. And this was kind of inconvenient. I never really saw the point of that, and they finally allowed you to just use the regular update message, so I think in 2016. Unfortunately for Microsoft, they've got to support all the legacy stuff where people have got plugins registered on set state. They've got people calling set state. They might have now people calling set state, but they've now got plugins registered on update and expecting that to just work. And they've done a really good job of actually making it work, but it does add in some complications. So if you've got a plugin registered on the set state message, and you go in and change the status through unified interface, you'll actually get an update message. And what happens there is within the main operation stage of the update message, it will actually start a child pipeline to run the set state or vice versa. If you running the assign message, you've got an integration that specifically calls the assign message. It will do all the normal assign pipeline, but where it gets to the main operation, it will start a new update one to say that an update of the owner ID property. So both of them will always get called no matter which one was called first, but it will change that that depth, that parent context, depending on which one was originally called. Your plugin will be fired either way, but it will be called with a slightly different context. So that's something to bear in mind if you're making these decisions based on what the parent context is when your plugin gets called. So far I've talked mainly about create, update, and that's probably the majority of any plugin, that's the majority of the messages that you will register a plugin on. But it's always worth thinking about, does it really make sense for this thing to be a plugin that's triggered whenever an update happens? Or is it really some other distinct operation which should happen against this record? And is it better to model that as a custom action, or nowadays custom API? So what's happening behind the scenes here is when you create a custom action, you're actually introducing a brand new message into Dataverse. So before you had create, update, delete, retrieve. Now you've got create, update, delete, retrieve, and my custom message, again with its own set of input parameters, output parameters, and all the rest of it, and its own plugin pipeline. So I will use generally actions and APIs interchangeably at this point, but the main difference is what happens in this main operation stage. Custom actions would have a main core operation defined using the workflow engine. And that workflow was executed during that main operation stage. However, the common pattern was to leave that blank. Who likes to use workflow after all when you could use a plugin? And you register a plugin in the post-operation stage synchronously. And then that will take the input parameters, do its processing, set any values on the output parameters, and those get returned back to the caller. Whereas with custom APIs, that workflow engine's gone, and you can now specifically register a plugin to run in that main operation stage, which is, hooray, we're in the main operation stage. It feels magical in here. No different to anywhere else, but there are new options that introduces to us, especially for an ISV point of view. I'll have a quick look at those. So when you go and create a custom API, for some reason it's in the old UI. I don't know why this doesn't just work on the unified interface, but here you go. We'll define the unique name is the message name that your application will call. At the very bottom, you can select a plugin that will get run within that main operation. It is exactly one plugin. You can't register a bunch of plugins to run in that stage. You can only select one. You don't have to do that. You can leave that blank and your message will work fine, and you can still leave your plugins registered in post-operation to work exactly how they did with custom actions. There's no problem with that. But if you've got exactly one plugin that used to run in post-operation and is really the core implementation of your message, if you move that to this main plugin at the bottom of this configuration page, what that lets you do is you can now choose how other people can register plugins against your message. And that's the allowed custom processing step type. And if you've got a message that you don't want other people to be messing with, a good example for an ISV might be you've got a message something to do with licensing. You don't want other people adding their own plugins onto your licensing message. If all your logic is now in the core plugin, you can change that custom processing step type to none, and now nobody else can register their own plugins against your message. Equally, if you've got something that you need to do a small amount of synchronous processing for to actually do the real work, and other people might want to get notified when that happens, but you don't want to stop, you don't want to slow down the processing of your message overall. You can do as I've done here and say you can only register plugins to run asynchronously. If someone tries to use plugin registration tool and add something that goes against that, they'll get an error and they can't register that plugin. So because we now don't need to register our main implementation of the message in a synchronous post-operation plugin and it's moved into the core type, we can use this extra parameter to restrict what other people can do now that our main processing is taken care of. I think Matt mentioned it earlier in his previous session. If you were in that, I did release a tool a few weeks ago to help people move from custom actions to custom APIs. And this takes a look at what plugins are registered to it. Is there a plugin that can be moved into that step? And after moving that, how restrictive can that custom processing step be to limit what people can do? So a bit of help there to try and move forwards with the new technology. So I don't think custom actions are going to go away anytime soon. There's too much legacy there for Microsoft to be deprecating that anytime soon, I think. But it never hurts to be on the latest. So we've got our plugin, it's registered, we're happy with where it is in the pipeline. We can use the context to get all the information we need about it, know why it's running so it can make good decisions about what it should do next. What if something goes wrong? So this is where the tracing service comes in. So the normal thing, the main thing that your plugin will need to get from the service provider that's passed into it is the plugin context. But I think just about the only other thing that you can get from it is the tracing service. And the tracing service basically just gives you a trace message and you can give it a string and you can start writing out details of maybe getting information from the input parameters. And then if something goes wrong later on, you can look at the plugin trace log and see what was the last thing that was written out. And that hopefully help you figure out what went wrong and go and fix it. But it's a bit sort of console.writeline, it's a bit printf debugging, which isn't great. So a few things to help us a little bit. First one I want to call out is there's a little library called Canary Tracer. So this is just a gist on GitHub from Jonas Rapp. There's a link there. It's not a nice link, so I wouldn't write it out. But if you Google it or if you get the slides later to get the link, that extends the tracing service with a trace context message method. And you can just pass it the entire context and you can configure it up with a few options there about how much of it should write out. But basically, this is going to dump the entire input parameters, output parameters, shared variables, the stage, optionally the parent context details. It understands how to write out all the entity reference, all those sorts of objects that are commonly in the context into an understandable way, so you don't have to reproduce this code every single time. So this is just a nice way to make sure you put this at the start of your plugin, and then if something goes wrong later on, you know you're going to have a good starting point of having the information you need to debug and fix the error. So that's fine, but if you ever tried to use the plugin tracelog form within the standard Dynamics app, it's basically unreadable. For some reason, they thought that 2 lines height text box was perfect for reading a tracelog. God knows who thought of that one. So I would highly recommend, if you're working with plugin tracelogs, then go and use the plugin trace viewer, again by Jonas Rapp. This gives a much nicer interface to go and browse around your plugin tracelogs, figure out what's going on. As a good example, again related to the whole parent-child pipeline idea, if you've got a plugin that triggers on the creator of an account that's going to go and, in this case, create a contact, and something goes wrong, what the user sees is that something went wrong when I was creating an account. And you go and you spend ages debugging all the plugins and whatever else that's triggered on creative account. But actually, it could be something that's triggered in a lower level pipeline, and something went wrong there, and it rolled the whole hierarchy of pipelines back. And this helps you debug that. And what I want to draw your attention to here particularly is the correlation ID in that first column. So what that's telling me here is these 2 plugins that are both labeled A. There's actually a GUI behind the scenes, but there's this tool that just breaks that down to A, B, C, D to make it, again, a lot more readable. That's showing that these 2 plugins ran as part of the same overall context, that they have the same top level plugin pipeline. And the first one that run was the creator of the account. That ran in the post-operation stage, and then that triggered another one that ran on creative contact, and that one threw an error. So that's immediately helped us drill down to say, okay, someone reported a problem when they created an account. We can see that that second row there was about creating an account, but just clicking on it, I can see that actually the problem occurred 1 layer down in creative contact, and I can go and immediately dig into where this problem has really happened. Actually, one thing to point out here is I clicked on that A there in that correlation column, and it's immediately highlighted the other A in sort of pinky color. That happens on all the different fields on here. So if you click around on the exception message, it will show all the other records that have the same exception, things like that. So it'll quickly highlight commonalities between all these different problems to help you really zoom in on where things are going wrong in your plugins. And on the right-hand side there in that trace message, that's the result of that canary tracer library. So just give you an example of the sort of detail that you just get with that 1 line of, I want to trace this context, and it's just dumped out this massive pile of text with all the information I could hope to find. And it's a bit early, but I think that just about wraps us up. I'd like to leave you there with a few links to some of the tools I mentioned and the library. But otherwise, if you've got any questions, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, say you can get in touch with me later on.
Thank you, Mark. It looks like we've got lots of applause. I don't know if we've got any more questions.
It's a very technical subject to do without, decided against doing sort of live code samples because I'd be here forever trying to get stuff working. So if anyone wants to sort of jump into any more of that in detail, I would be happy to. I know it's very sort of PowerPoint heavy, but hopefully get some of the concepts across to get people started.
I just had one thing to sort of more of a musing, I guess, really. I just wonder in terms of today whether, you know, plugins are the safe option compared to real-time workflows. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've used both over time. I would say, yeah, real-time workflow. I mean, the writing's got to be on the wall at some point, surely. They are still a supported option at the moment, but I wouldn't be doing much more new investment in it. If there's, I would personally probably find it just as quick to write the plugin as I would to write the real-time workflow, to be honest. But that's me. I think unless you've got a real use case for saying that, yeah, I need to be able to maintain this as a workflow, and I need people that understand workflows and not code to maintain it, then that's probably the only reason to do it at this point. I think, I mean, what are people using real-time workflows for these days? Sort of to set some values to stop things happening with a stop workflow node.
I guess it's more synchronous stuff, you know, that's what I'm thinking really. And I flip-flop over this quite a bit, whether, okay, should I do it the functional way or go code, you know. I guess for anything async, yeah, Power Automate, absolutely 100%.
Yeah, so the real-time workflows that I've written probably could be done in a handful of lines of code and would be just as maintainable. But it's going to depend, I guess, on the skills that you've got available, right? So if you've got a dev to hand that can spend 10 minutes knocking up a quick and simple plugin for you, then that's an option. If you don't, then workflow is probably your only way for the moment until you've got synchronous flows. So it's horses for courses, I think. But yes, for me, absolutely, I would be doing the plugin rather than the synchronous workflow. That's me.
Thanks, Mark. There is one other question from Andrew in the chat.
Does the canary tracer ever lead to trace logs that get truncated? I haven't seen it. There must be a limit to it. It's going to be more likely, I guess, with very deep plugin pipelines where you get down to that, you know, depth 8, 9, 10, and you've got it configured to write out all the parent pipelines as well. So there'll be a lot of information going in there. Yes, I'm not sure what that limit is. I can find that out. Interesting question. Not one I've seen though. I think it's long enough for it to be not a problem for the vast majority of cases. Let's say that.
Great, thank you. I don't think there's any other questions, but obviously if you have anything, then please feel free to raise your hand or add it in the chat. Otherwise, I'd just like to say thank you to Mark for that great presentation, and to remind everybody to fill in your feedback surveys, please. And then we have the Ask the Expert session in about 12 minutes time. I'd like to join that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Great session.
Thanks.